So, Professor Senge, thank you so much for being with us today on Sartor TV. You updated your famous book, The Fifth Discipline, in 2010. What's the central thesis?
Oh, well, the book really was an attempt to make sense of many, many years of working with a relatively small number back then of very innovative managers and organizations. And, what seemed to characterize situations where people really worked at their best, individually and collectively. And we didn't even have a term like learning organization initially. We had a lot of tools and methods because we had been working with systems thinking and mental models and building shared vision and stuff like that for a long while. But it got to a certain point and it was really time to kind of organize the experiences. And it was really in the writing of the book, the original book, that the whole idea of 5 disciplines, as 5 kind of bodies of theory and method came together, which seemed to encompass much of what the most effective and innovative managers and organizations were doing. Anyhow, so that kind of led ultimately to the book, and it was one of those things, you just had to get it out of the way so you could go back to work. I'm not really a writer. People who are writers, that's the main thing they do is write. I do it when I have to do it on the side.
What developments spurred you to update the 5th discipline?
Well, the publisher mainly. They're like that. They're saying, "Hey, can't you do?" But it didn't take much spurring. I wouldn't have done it if it didn't feel right. And obviously there'd been a lot more practical experience, and I was really avoiding it for a long time, and I'd say, sure, good idea, call me later, sort of thing. But then I got thinking about a process that really I thought would be a lot of fun and would be very illuminating. And basically I just made a short list of about, I don't remember, it was about 12 people who I really admired as, I guess I would call them master managers, really people who are masterful at building these sort of organizations. And I thought, well, it'll be really fun. I'll just interview each of them and then see what comes out of it. And that became the 100 new pages of stuff that went into the revised edition.
What are some of the problems in the prevailing systems of management that you originally wrote about back in the 90s, but are also still plaguing us today a bit?
Well, there's always been a tendency for management to be exploitative. And what I mean by that is, it basically exploits people to accomplish the goals of some small number of people. So in that sense, people are there to be used to accomplish the goals of, as I say, a few, the owners, the founders, the bosses. And that's always been a problem, and there have always been exceptions. So where that is not the prevailing philosophy. But I also think that, over time, lots of things change that create new kind of forces at play. So just to be more specific, there are industries today, like the software industry is a good example, where the sheer complexity of what people are doing have really forced more and more organizations to throw out a lot of traditional ideas of management. Imagine you create a product. We're making a TV product right now. Imagine you're creating a product where you actually do all this work, but you don't know what's going to happen. You're building this car, but when somebody turns the wheel to the left, the car may go to the right, or they hit the brake and it may accelerate. That's a whole new world. That's the world of software today. The environments of the software environments within which new software products are being integrated have now reached a level of complexity that literally no one knows what that new element of software will do. I'm just using this to illustrate. I don't think this is as true of any other industry, but it might be a trend that will affect a lot of industries. It's certainly true in software. And when you get to that point, you have to kind of give up control. The idea that we're going to do this and it's going to produce that outcome. And that I've always thought was the fundamental error in the, let's just say, the mainstream management. This basic belief that a small number of people can control an enterprise and ultimately obviously control others, tell them what to do. The classic assembly line would be the icon the archetype of this. Somebody sets up the assembly line, and then the workers are just really nothing more than one more type of machine in a process that somebody else controls. That's not the way our families work. Anybody thinks they're in control of their family, they're kind of a delusional state, right? You're like, oh yeah, I'm in complete control of my teenager.
Right.
So it's interesting, as soon as we shift over and think about the world of social realities, families, relationships, the image of control just has to change. Obviously, no one's in control as you would be of a machine. But I think that's exactly what happened in that, you might say, the industrial age, the machine age. This kind of thinking of somebody in control gradually spread more and more till it infected all of management. And management became a process of how to control things. So I think that's always been problematic, because the obvious reason, nobody wants to be on the receiving end.
Right.
Someone else in control. Yet it still kind of became the mainstream, and it's really what was taught in business schools. Your purpose of the business is to maximize the return of investors' capital, and your job as a manager is to control things so that happens, and blah blah blah. So I think that became a kind of a mass hypnotic situation where people started to believe this was really doable, and it's breaking down, for good reason. It's never been a great idea for a lot of reasons. Like, as I said, no one really wants to be controlled, so it's always limited creativity, engagement, spirit, people feeling genuinely committed to what they're doing. But it was still the mainstream, and I think it's breaking down now, because in fact reality is starting to show people that that's no longer the case. As I said, the software industry is a good example. It's not the only one though, but I think it's becoming pervasively understood that the products they're building cannot be determined. We do this and this is the outcome. The consequence then, just like it is in all other aspects of life, if you're not in control, then all you can do is learn. You do something, you try something, and then you have to see if it works or not. And that's kind of the fundamental divide, so to speak. This kind of mindset of control versus a mindset of learning. And literally the way things work in the software industry now is people introduce new elements of software. They used to do it on 9-month cycles. Now typically they do it on 1 to 2, 3 week cycles, because they try to take small steps, and then everybody has to think about, well, what's happening? You have to gather a lot of data. You have to reflect, well, gee, that's doing something crazy. Why do we think that's going? So it's a lot more like learning to walk than it is controlling a machine. You try something, and then you have to see how it works. So that was always, you might say, the fundamental idea, you might say, from a cultural standpoint. What was the culture of an organization that really is fundamentally about learning, not controlling?
What are the 3 core learning capabilities?
Well, this took, of course, many, many years, and we had a lot of different kinds of ideas, but gradually it coalesced into one, this kind of spirit of deep intention, you might say, or aspiration may even be a better word. What do we really want to create here? To engage in learning is hard. It's common. We all learn to walk, we all learn to talk, but at a point in your life you didn't walk. Right? And at a point in your life you didn't talk. At some point the learner crystallizes a vision, something they really want to be able to do. And without that learning process never happens. So that crystallization of aspiration or intention and vision would be an example of what that is like when you crystallize it. Well, what actually are we trying to accomplish here? That's really critical. And building the capability to foster vision personally and collectively has always been a core leadership capability. But then, of course, you try things, as I was saying, and they don't work. So the ability to reflect, well, we tried that, what happened? And it's kind of an obvious thing in a way, because we can't think of any learning process, walking, riding a bicycle, anything like that, where it isn't the basic process of trying something and then seeing how it works. But when you're learning to walk or learning to ride a bicycle, it's just you. And the reflection process is a little more immediate, and it's obviously mostly neuromuscular kind of stuff. There is a reflection process going on, but it's not at a conceptual level, and it's not collective. So in an organizational setting, that reflective dynamic is not only simple actions. It's actions that are much more complex, involve many, many people, and you've got to really think together about, well, what's going on here? If you looked at how those the real leading software companies work, they organize all kinds of reflective processes, and they have people whose roles is to get people together, usually online, and gather a lot of data and look at the data. That data is important because that tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you what you need to understand. So that process of going from an observation, some data, to an understanding of what's going on is the process of reflection. What did we expect to happen, but what did happen? How were we thinking that might have been off? How do we have to think differently to get an outcome that we really want? That's the process of reflection. And the only big addition to it, of course, is that in an organizational or work setting, it's collective, not just individual. So that's the second core capacity. We've often called it the capacity for a reflective conversation, to have different qualities of communication and conversation that allow people to actually enhance their ability to think and think together effectively in complex settings. And the third capability is to understand the complexity. And these are really, if I could say it's a three-sided coin, I'd say they're three sides of the same coin. Different ways to tease out an interrelated set of capacities, but to see the larger system. This has always been a problem in businesses. They focus in any organization. Everybody gets fragmented. You do this, you do this, you do this, and everybody forgets what everybody else is doing because they're so busy doing their thing. The assembly line would be kind of the archetypal example. Everybody doing literally they called it their piece. It was all piecework. But organizations everywhere suffer from silos, fragmentation, chimneys. People use different metaphors in different parts of the world or country. But that problem of not seeing how it goes together, not having the skills and the time to step back and go, wait a second, if you do it this way and you do this and you do this and you do this, it actually might not add up to what we want. So seeing the larger system is always a crucial leadership skill. And today, more than ever, it's not just important within, but between. So within the organization, yes, that's true, because we do get fragmented. And that's why working in teams has become one of the most important developments, I would say, in management in the last 20 years. Now, virtually everybody works in teams. So at least in that team, a bunch of people have to put things together and think about what each other is doing. Now, between the teams, they can still kind of get in a lot of trouble. But at least it's moving in the right direction. But increasingly, the systems we need to understand are not just individual organizations. They're networks of organizations. I spend all my time in the last decade working on big projects that are collaborations amongst many different organizations. For example, in the food industry, trying to see what it takes to manage the whole of a food supply chain for the well-being of the farmers and the health of the farming ecology, the use of water, as well as the quality of the food that eventually comes out. But if you don't manage the whole of that system, ultimately that system will fail, and that's exactly what is happening in a lot of our agriculture around the world. So those are the three core capabilities: being able to cultivate aspiration, reflection, and seeing the larger system.
What are the first four disciplines of a learning organization?
Well, in the way the original fifth discipline was set up, I think it started off with personal mastery and building shared vision, then mental models and team learning. So, as I said before, that core capability of fostering aspiration is both individual and collective. So, everybody wants to have a shared vision. Every manager wants his team or her team or their organization to have a shared vision, but shared visions don't grow from thin air. They are expressions, or they're outgrowths of individual vision. So if you don't nurture personal vision, if you don't create an environment where people can really be thinking about what matters to them and what are they really passionate about contributing to, you're not going to get a shared vision. So in a sense, personal vision is the soil, but shared visions can be grown. If you don't have the right soil nutrients, forget it. Doesn't matter how hard you work. What you'll get is everybody going, yes, sir, boss, we got the vision. But of course, it doesn't mean anything to people. The shared vision is then just a hollow, expression of one or two or three people's goals, again, foisted on the organization. So that's back to that exploitative management I was referring to before. So you have to nurture or create an environment where people can be growing personally, developing their own sense of vision, their own capacities to accomplish the things they really want to accomplish. So that personal mastery cornerstone, in a way, was always one of the most radical ideas in the 5 disciplines, because I think it's very, very hard for many organizations to embrace the idea that we're actually creating an environment here for each person to grow. I think a lot of managers espouse that. They want to believe it, but to really be committed to it is another matter. It's not easy. It's not simple. There's a brand new book that's just coming out now, which kind of is the next generation of this idea. A very famous developmental theorist at Harvard named Bob Kegan, Kegan, has been working on an idea which got a good article in Harvard Business Review earlier last year, and the book is just coming out now. They call it Deeply Developmental Organizations. And basically the idea is that an organization is, in fact, the organization truly committed to the fullest development of every single person. And so, as I said, I've always thought that was in many ways one of the most radical ideas. So it's interesting that 25 years later, there's now a lot of study, and this is all based on research in the last 5 years or so, and an articulation of what was always the idea behind personal mastery at the beginning. So that was always the first of the core disciplines, and it takes a little time to explain it, because if you don't get that, then a lot of the others don't make sense.
Right.
Building shared vision is the second, and again, that's kind of an outgrowth of personal mastery, because that's all the skills, the leadership skills, and how you help people really kind of see, well, what are we trying to create together here? The third discipline was the discipline of mental models. That goes back to what I was talking about earlier about reflection. At the personal level, what does it mean to cultivate my ability or develop my ability to reflect? We all see the world as we see it, and then we get mixed up, and we think what we see is what exists. It's you might say, the fundamental error of all perception. Oh yeah, I heard what she said. But if you actually go back and listen to a recording of what was said, it isn't what she said at all. It's what I heard she said. But I don't say, oh, I heard this. I think the person said this. But, we all hear what we hear, and we take what we hear as the facts. So that gap between what actually happens and what we perceive to happen is the gap that requires reflection. Reflection wouldn't be needed if there wasn't such a gap. But we're not recording devices. None of us hear exactly what's said. None of us see exactly what happened. We see what we see. We hear what we hear. And then, again, in a non-reflective orientation, which is the common one, we take our awareness as truth. And, that's how we get all the intractable arguments in the world. Each person, each group has got their truth. And it's the truth. It's not, oh, here's my view. Here's the way I see things. And that integrates into the fourth discipline of team learning, because what creates a real learning environment in a team at its most fundamental level is a group of people who are humble in that sense, are willing to reflect and say, well, look, here's how I see it. But I know I don't see the whole picture. How do you see it? Oh, here's how I see it. What data or what facts do you have to support you? Oh, well, you see some facts that I don't see, because you're actually a salesperson. You actually talk to the customer. And I work on products. And anyhow, whatever. That process of groups of people becoming skillful at really reflecting together is actually the core of team learning. So those are the first 4 disciplines.
There's a fascinating concept in your book in which you say that our actions can actually create reality. What do you mean by this? Tell us a little more about it and how it can inform organizational management.
Well, that really was the kind of doorway to understanding the 5th discipline, which is systems thinking. And I've always thought the most elegant definition of systems or systems thinking is seeing how our own actions are shaping our reality. And we don't see that because we don't see the larger system. So I remember when our oldest son was just a kid, and we'd notice a certain pattern. He'd come back from the playground, maybe he was 3 or 4, and I don't think this was idiosyncratic to him. So, he would be telling us, oh, so-and-so is a good friend, and da-da-da, and we so he's always talking about his friends, and then sometimes, a month later, that friend would now be somebody he didn't like at all. Oh, he's really a jerk. And every kid has a story, right? A story why he did what he did as a jerk. But if you examine that story, you'll often see something like this. Oh, well, we were playing and he threw some sand in my face. Oh, yeah, well, did he do that? Yeah, he really did that. That's not a fiction. But why did he throw the sand in my face? Well, because yesterday he asked to use my truck and I told him no. So he got really mad. So I don't see that today getting the sand in my face was a result of yesterday having been unwilling to share my truck. I just don't see that system.
Right.
I don't see what in the engineers we used to always call that the feedback loop between something I did and some consequence it has in my reality, which then leads to something new coming my way, which then I react to. So we see our action, maybe, we sometimes don't even see that, but to some degree we see our action, and when we see ourselves reacting to some new situation, we don't see what connects them. So the best doorway to understand systems thinking is our social reality. It's very complex. The reality of relationships is kind of our entryway for all of us as human beings into seeing the system. But we don't often. And it's one of the reasons that relationships are an ongoing, lifelong struggle. We're doing things and we don't see the many ramifications of what we do on others around us. So therefore, their actions or reactions are often kind of obtuse to us. We don't get it. And yet that's what's going on all the time. And you can just take that and extend it. Businesses don't see the consequences of their actions on the communities in which they operate. Societies don't see the consequences of their actions on other societies. Every country follows its own self-interest, not realizing that a lot of problems it has in the world are because of other countries that it finds themselves opposed, because you don't see how following your self-interest has actually caused problems for another. So whether it's kids on a playground or up to the global stage, this inability to see the larger system leads us to not seeing how we are in fact shaping our reality.
The fifth discipline is systems thinking. What is systems thinking?
Well, you can start off with what we were just saying, the ability to see the consequences of my own actions. You could also look at it from slightly different angles and say, to see the connections in any situation, and to understand better how things unfold over time. Because again, we're reacting to an immediate situation. That's always the truth. Something happens and we react. We don't see how that situation may in fact have been influenced by things we did or contributed to doing in the past. So to see more clearly how things unfold over time and to see the web of interconnectedness within which we always live and act is really the technical definition of systems thinking.
Part of your update of the fifth discipline was to include reflections from practice in the years that have gone by since it first came out in 1990. What is one reflection from practice that stands out for you?
Well, first off, it was a lot of fun because I just picked people I really want to talk to. I picked a small set of my own heroes, people I admired enormously, and just the excuse of getting on the phone with them, and I knew them all well, so I could do it all by phone. Getting on the phone with them for an hour and then writing something and then sending it back to them, and it was just a great pleasure. One of them was a woman named Barbara Stocking, who's retired now. She's now Dame Barbara Stocking. She was the president of Oxfam. And I had known Barbara even before she was in that job. Oxfam is stands for Oxford Famine Relief. It's in Europe probably the single most reputable, really admired social justice NGO. In UK, where of course Oxfam is based, Oxfam is actually a global network. There's about 20 Oxfams all around the world, like there is an Oxfam US. But the mothership is the original Oxford in Oxford, and it's one of the 5 most respected brands in the UK. Right up there, with Nike and Apple and whatever. Just really well-known brands. So Barbara was the president of Oxfam for about 10 years. I knew her throughout that whole time, and I knew her, as I said, even before she took that job. She'd actually come out of the British healthcare system prior to that. And she was remarkably effective, and we ended up working on some wonderful projects. I made the comment I did earlier about global food systems. Today there's a network of about 70 of the world's largest food companies and NGOs, organizations like Oxfam, World Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, all working together to try to make sustainable agriculture the mainstream system, which will take many decades. Now, that got started because of Barbara. And I'll never forget when I was doing the interview with Barbara, she made a simple comment which just illuminated a lot. She said, I've always been a developmentally oriented manager. Those were her words. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, well, the development of my people has always been as important to me as producing results. I've always seen those as the two cornerstones of my work as a manager. So that was a very simple articulation. I'd never heard it quite that directly before, of obviously a cornerstone of the work we had all been involved in.
What makes a great leader?
Well, first off, I always worry when we use the word leader that we have to define it. We tend to think of leader as boss. If you look at how the word's normally used, the leaders around here. Or the problem with that organization is its leaders. Those may be accurate statements, but, what does it mean? Well, it means the people at the top. It actually isn't really what the word means. The verb to lead comes from an Indo-European root, L-E-I-T-H, leith, and it literally means to step ahead, to step across the threshold. And if you think about it, the people in our lives who have really influenced us as leaders, they're in all kinds of different roles. Mm-hmm. It could be a teacher, right? It could be a relative. And so leadership is not about role. That's the most important thing to everybody to understand. Mm. Management is about role. If you're a manager, you're being paid to be accountable for results produced by others. So management is a perfectly legitimate profession. But leadership is different. Leadership is, you might say, more the spirit that animates good management. Good managers can be really good leaders if they have a sense of purpose and they really care about their people, like I was illustrating with Barbara a minute ago. I think leadership is always about how we create. How generative is an enterprise? That's a really good indicator of the quality of leadership. Are people really passionate about their work? As I said, it's much more about the spirit of things, as opposed, you might say, to the operations of things. They're both really important. If you want to have a really good organization, you want the operations to work. You want, you might say, the machinery to work. You want the pay systems to be fair. You want the performance management review systems to be well thought out. You want to be using the right metrics, not the wrong metrics. All the nuts and bolts of good management. But you also want to be passionate. And you want to care about what you do, and you want to care about the people with whom you do it. So all of those are, you might say, the spirit of the enterprise. And leadership is probably the simplest way we have that kind of we all recognize of talking about, the human contributions to shaping the spirit of an enterprise. Our best definition, the one I've always liked the most of leadership, is it's kind of odd one, and there's a lot of definitions out there which are, I think, too individualistic, because I think leadership is both very individual and very collective. It's both. My favorite definition has always been the capacity of a human community to shape its future. Oh, wow. Because that expresses to me the spirit that really characterizes great leadership. People really believe they can shape their future, and they're passionately engaged in doing things that really matter to them.
What can these types of leaders and all their different iterations do to create a culture of innovation in an organization? Are there specific things that can happen?
Sure. Well, first off, what I just said, another way to say it would be a culture of innovation. I think sometimes people think innovation is just technical, but it literally means creating new sources of value. An enterprise that creates new sources of value, new things, services, products, doesn't matter what it is, that really are genuinely of use to somebody. So in that sense, innovation is not about business, it's about any kind of enterprise. Peter Drucker used to have a very elegant way of talking about this, the kind of famous management guru. I mean, really the most famous management thinker of the certainly the second half of the 20th century. He used to say the discipline, he called it the discipline of innovation, has three elements. One is you must have a sense of purpose. So he called it mission. So it's back to that spirit. What are we doing here? And why does it matter? Do I tell my kids what I do? Do I care enough? So there must be a sense of mission or purpose. And secondly, you need to crystallize that into particular things you're trying to accomplish. So that's where the idea of vision comes in, right? So yes, here's what we're doing, here's what matters, here's the purpose of Sartor TV, we're engaged in something here we think really matters. Oh, and in this little interview right now, and in this product we're doing right now, or this project, here's what we're actually trying to accomplish. So vision crystallizes this general sense of purpose into something more tangible. And something you can say, this is what we're actually trying to accomplish in the next 3 months or 2 years. So you have to have a sense of purpose. You have to crystallize it into results or outcomes that really matter to people. And then you have to be willing to kind of abandon things. I think literally that was the word Drucker used to write about. He used to call it the discipline of abandonment. Wow. There are things that aren't working. But, golly, I love doing those things. And we got old Charlie over here who's done it for 20 years. I love old Charlie. So, it's not that you got to go abandon Charlie, but you got to help Charlie abandon something that's not working anymore. And that is in the large and in the small. And what I mean by in the large, Drucker used to often say, and for businesses this is really tough, a lot of times you've got to abandon a part of the business when it's still making a lot of money. And managers don't want to do that. But it's really the past, not the future. And that it's sucking up a lot of resources, and even more than that, it's sucking up a lot of, I'd say, mental resources. It kind of defines us by who we were, not by who we need to become. And that's obviously a very tricky matter. So it may be in the large sense of, this is a product that still makes a lot of money, but it's really also draining a lot of our resources, keep propping it up. At a certain point, he said, you often have to abandon that product. That may mean just spinning it off or selling it to somebody else, even when it's still making money. But if you want to sell it off to somebody else, that's actually a good time to do it, when it's still making money. But it reflects, again, this kind of generative spirit. It's our past, not our future. And the exact same thing is true within a learning cycle. So what I was talking about before, about reflection, another way to say that is, at the individual and in team level, we've got to abandon things that used to be really good, but they're not helping us anymore. So there are habits of the past, and you can, again, take that one step more and say, that's what it means to be a human being. To really be growing as a human being, you've got to be letting go of things. Because those things which are very near and dear to your own ego structure and your sense of who you are may actually be the things that are keeping you right now from being who you might become.
What's the biggest change or development that you've seen in the learning industry since you updated the book in 2010?
Well, I'd say two. One is this extension in space. So now a lot of the most interesting projects are these big collaborative projects, like I was talking about in the food industry. Many, many different enterprises, many different companies and NGOs working together to really assure that a food supply chain is viable for the next 20 or 30 years. For example, the way coffee is sourced today is a big collaborative effort. And even big companies like Starbucks have been real leaders. They were part of the Global Food Lab, which is what that network is called, Global Sustainable Food Lab, or just Sustainable Food Lab, I guess is what they call it today. And the coffee industry now, they're much more on top of, what's the impact of this choice or this choice or this choice of coffee for those coffee growing communities, and of course for the ecologies within which they operate. So that's been a big change, this extension to looking at larger systems, which was always the intent, but I would say was not being done very well at all. I'll just take a very different example. Nike was one of the founders of the Sustainability Consortium, which was one of the precursors of the Food Lab, when we were looking at all kinds of different industries, not just food. And Nike's main focus was on waste and toxicity, how to design their whole business so as to steadily reduce waste, reduce toxicity, and reduce energy use and water use. All products in Nike now are rated based on those 4 elements today.
Really?
Yeah. But today, Nike, the most fascinating scale project in the world that I know of right now, is Nike, Reebok, Adidas, and Puma, the 4 largest athletic shoe makers in the world, working with Greenpeace and actually several other NGOs to systematically identify and eliminate all the key toxins in the totality of the China supply chain.
Wow.
In the apparel industry. They have a system map that covers a wall because they're tracking all these different sources of toxins. And Greenpeace really pushed them to do this, but behind the scenes, it was Nike saying, yes, please push us, because Nike is a world leader in this area. Mm-hmm. And they said the only way we'll ever do it is to get all the big buyers, who are obviously intense competitors, working together, because together they create enough signals to radiate throughout the whole of this vast supply network. Literally tens of thousands, when you trace it in the lingo of the industry, the first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers. It gets to be tens of thousands of enterprises all over China, and in fact all over Southeast Asia, who are supplying the suppliers of the suppliers, right back to the chemical producers of something that gets used in a process to treat leather or plastic or whatever. And to think that you could actually achieve that level of collaboration, it would have been unthinkable, a decade ago. But that's exactly what's going on today. It's called the Road to Zero. You can, I think, Google that today. Probably Greenpeace maintains the website, and it's to get to zero toxins in the totality of this supply chain. So that's been a huge development. This extension in space. I would say the other one was always kind of implicit, but Bob Keegan's new book, Deeply Developmental Organizations, is a good illustration. You might say the extension in depth. To really start to get more and more serious, what does it really mean to grow human beings? I don't think that's a question any of us understand. I think we have an extremely limited notion of humanness. I think when you contrast, the mainstream Western psychological perspectives of the last 100 years with a lot of the ancient, both indigenous and Eastern philosophic cultivation systems, there's really big gaps. We really don't understand mind very well at all. It's interesting to see mindfulness now becoming a common, almost term, because people understand that, one, first off, it's pretty important for healthy, happy people, but I'd say also there's a growing awakening that our understanding of consciousness is extremely limited. We live in this confusion that a human being is a body, and then it drives all of our business to make it pretty and to make it healthy and all that. And of course, those are very nice things, but it's actually not who we are. And at some level, intuitively, everybody knows that.
Right.
And those are, cornerstone ideas of, you might say, religious or spiritual traditions forever. In the West, it got very complicated because spirituality and religion got completely entangled. So you couldn't talk about these things except in a religious context. And I'm not speaking against religion now, but it made it political, ultimately.
Yeah.
Which is what institutions, including religious institutions, do. They create dynamics of power. Whereas these are timeless ideas. The soul's journey is not a Western or even religious notion. It's a universal notion. It's accepted and understood by countless traditions. And so this deepening and finding ways to go more deeply into this domain of human development, but to do it in secular terms, to do it in non-religious terms, to do it in terms that you can even relate to science, which I think has been one of the big developments of neuroscience in the last 20 or 30 years. People are now able to talk about, aspects of our emotional state and our emotional well-being in ways that correlate with neural configurations. And I'm not saying that's like what everybody needs to understand, because many of us experience neural configurations, but it just illustrates there's this wonderful ferment, East and West. Not just in the West, but in the East as well. I spend about a month a year in China. And I tell you, the thing that more people want to talk about than anything else is, please help us understand how our traditional Chinese philosophies and practices of cultivation are relevant today. We're trying to rediscover who we are. Because there's really no storehouse of cultural wisdom in the world that's greater than what the Chinese have. 5,000 years, some would say 10,000 years of steady refinement, of understanding of human development, but all completely lost in the last few hundred years, of being overrun by the West, being colonized, then being caught up in the tumult of the Cultural Revolution, which was trying to expunge all that history so that the country could move forward for better or worse, and then of course being completely caught up in Western modernization and consumerism in the last 2 or 3 decades. So as the Chinese say, we've had a few tough centuries, but they have the benefit of a fairly long time perspective. So for them, it's just a few tough centuries, but they have lost a lot. And I'm just using this to illustrate this kind of unsettledness, this ferment to understand human development more deeply, I believe is one of the deepest dynamics occurring in the world today, East and West. And if they start to come together, it'll be very, very powerful. We'll realize that we really have a lot we could learn from each other. So those are the two things I see that's really different today, this extension in space and this deepening.
What is your definition of a learning organization, and how can leaders build a learning organization? What types of resources do you need?
Well, first off, I would jettison the jargon. A term like that, the learning organization, is always to some degree going to be jargony, and therefore gets to be off-putting for people. Just think of it as people working together at their best. How do we grow organizations where that's the norm? And it's a continual, relentless process to keep learning how to work together at our best. Because if you're doing that, you're going to be learning. As I said, there's only 2 mindsets that kind of can infiltrate an organization: control or learning. And it's a question of which one is dominant. And if learning dominates, I guarantee you'll create all the different aspects of what we call a learning organization. I think that, the how-to is obviously what all the work has always been about. And that's why there's not only the original 5th discipline, there's the 5th discipline field book, there's the Dance of Change field book, there's even a field book strictly on doing this in educational context. It's called Schools That Learn. And those field books are like 600 pages of stories and examples and tips and tools. So there's a lot of how-to. So you can't really summarize it very completely in a brief form. But it comes back to those 3 broad areas, but there are tools we talked about before. The 3 broad areas, fostering aspiration. There are tools for encouraging, building personal mastery and building shared vision. Creative tension is a very basic tool that individuals learn how to work with. There are tools for fostering reflection. The ladder of inference is a tool that we found once people learn, they never, stop using it. And in teams, it's enormously powerful. It's basically just a way to in a more disciplined way, distinguish what actually happened from my interpretations and attributions about what happened, all my assumptions, and becoming disciplined at distinguishing fact from assumption, you might say. Assumptions are really important. It's not that they're bad. You don't ever get rid of assumptions. You can't live without assumptions. The question is, are we disciplined in relating those to what's actually happening? So those are a set of tools. And then in the systems understanding and seeing larger systems, there's a whole set of tools, system archetypes, seeing basic patterns of systemic activity, like what we call shifting the burden, a pattern where there's a problem and people focus quickly on a quick fix. But they know there's a deeper source of the problem. And if they get caught up in the quick fix, they never get to the deeper source. So understanding those systemic patterns, we call them archetypal patterns, system archetypes. So there's tools all over the place. So you need to have tools to work with. And that's why all these big field books exist. And a lot of those tools have evolved. But there's plenty out there. But then you also need to have a commitment to this. So we often call it the guiding ideas. So what does the organization stand for? In Bob Keegan's recent book on deeply developmental organizations, he gives 3 examples of organizations that are very explicitly, by their philosophy, by their actions, by their day-to-day practice, dedicated to the continual development of their people. So you need to have, you might say, a philosophic framework to kind of orient you. And then you need to have time. So the 3 things we say that always matter in practice are, do you have tools? Do you have a kind of guiding philosophy, what we often call guiding ideas, that help people orient that we're not here just to make money. Yeah, we want to be a good business, but we want to be a good business that also grows people, and we really mean it. And do you have time? Do you have the internal, we often call them learning infrastructures. If there's no time to reflect, it doesn't matter how skillful you are at reflection. If there's no way to kind of organize and study what's being learned in different places, people doing this and learning this, but over here people are wrestling with the same problem. They have no clue what the people have learned over here because there's no infrastructure that shares that learning. In the software industry now, it's amazing. And partly this is because it's being done more online. They're coordinating these distributed development teams remotely. So they actually have a lot of data and they can share it. So that what we often call the learning infrastructure, the time, the resources to study and learn, help people learn from each other, bring people together. I know it's mundane, but do people ever get together? And if they get together, do they do something other than watch stupid PowerPoints?
Right.
That's like the dumbest thing in the whole world. Why would you bring people together, which is a big undertaking, and not use the time for real learning? Do you know how to do that? Do you have the tools? If you have the time, do you know how to use the tools? So, for example, any of the organizations are really good at this. They're really good at hosting meetings where people actually spend time really learning. They have World Cafes, one of the tools that's propagated widely in our networks as a way to organize big meetings. In any event, so you need all three of those. You need tools, you need a philosophy, and you need infrastructure to make it all real.
Yes, I find it so interesting in the book that you talk about learning as metanoia.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us a little about that learning.
Well, it was a word we used to use before we had this term learning organization. As I said before, we didn't actually have that term, but we knew it was about a fundamental shift in how people thought. And it's this reorientation, this ultimately letting go of control and embracing learning as living, you might say, or learning as leading. The best leaders are the best learners. That's a radical shift in mindset. It's easy to say it, but it so contradicts most of our images of leaders. People in control, right? Mm-hmm. People at the top of the pyramid. People who project this image of, being forceful and dramatic, and I've got the answer, otherwise nobody will follow me. As opposed to, no, here's what we're working on, and my job as the person in position of authority is to help organize things so we can actually accomplish it and learn as we go so we can accomplish more. So all these, we knew from the beginning, represented a radical shift in awareness. So we actually went back to a very old idea, and I'll tell you whimsically, one of the reasons we started using it was we knew nobody would ever be able to write a book to do based on making this idea a bestseller. It was way, way, way too esoteric. Metanoia. Very few people have ever heard the term. But it means a fundamental movement or shift in mind. Noia as from the Greek nous, and meta as in moving beyond. Fundamental movement of mind. So we thought, we always knew that to do this would require very, very deep shifts in our, you might say, our orientation. And that's why I said, to me, one of the most heartening developments. There's a lot of problems in the world, but one of the most heartening developments is more and more people realizing that we really don't understand very well what it means to be a human being, what it means to be conscious, and that this deepening, as I was calling it before, that's why deeply developmental organizations, I love the phrase, this deepening, was what we were always pointing to. We started using the term metanoia around 1980 or 81 because it was very clear from even our initial experiences working with different some of the initial practitioners, people doing these things, that they just had a different point of view, a profoundly different point of view. They were much more oriented towards their connections with each other and the larger world. They were much more open. They knew they weren't in control. They were trying to do as good a job as they could, but they knew they were not in control in any total sense. And they were really on a journey of becoming human beings. So, and that turns out in our Western tradition, although the word has been lost as a Greek word, it actually is probably the best word in the Judeo-Christian, well, particularly the Christian Western tradition. The word metanoia was what was eventually translated in the Catholic corpus as repent. But it was apparently the word that was actually used. Metanoia, metanoia, the kingdom of God is at hand. You must have a shift of mind or you'll never see it. So that's why we picked the word, because it was really esoteric. No one would ever try to write a bestseller based on metanoic organizations, although that's actually the papers we wrote a long time ago, but also because there was an element of it that was really hitting the nail right on the head. And I think maybe today, at a global level, because we've got to separate this from any particular religious tradition, we're now maybe at a point where we can start to get serious about this and see, no, nothing will really change unless there is a very fundamental movement of mind.
And what do you think could potentially spur that? Because it is so counterintuitive. Is there...
Well, I don't think it's going to be easy. It's not easy. I think what's going to spur it is the breakdowns we see all around us. Our way of operating is simply not going to work much longer. We're destabilizing the climate. We're destroying ecosystems around the world. Youth unemployment is arguably the single biggest social issue in the world. It lies behind almost all the social turmoil, certainly all the terrorism that goes on in the world. It's not the organizers of the terrorism that's the problem, it's the recruits. And they're all young people with no future because they grow up in societies that have no real ability to create meaningful paths for them. So whether you look at it from a social perspective or an ecological or biological perspective, or just look at our state of happiness, we really are on a path to nowhere in the mainstream. And outside the mainstream, all these amazing things are happening. So I think, one, it becomes more and more necessary, and two, it becomes more and more possible.